Okay, so, sup buggers. I have just recently recovered from the hyperventilating I did during the most recent Archon quest, Chapter 3, Act 5, and I think I'm ready to break it down line by line because Lord knows we need to talk about some things. So right off, I'm not going to do the entire quest. I'm mostly going to be covering things that happened from the Skara fight to the end, so that obviously means a lot of spoilers. So if for some whack reason you haven't actually finished the Sumeru Archon quest, then do it before watching this video because you're in for a treat. Okay, formalities out of the way already, let's get to it. Let's start with the first cutscene after entering the arena to face off against Scaramouche. The first thing we see Nahida do to Skara when we walk into that room is to put Skara into a samsara of some sort, something that he had the academia do to us and everybody else in Sumeru for his own personal gain, which I think that's kind of a cool karma moment. After Skara awakens, he says that he is surprised that the world is so eager for his quote-unquote birth and that he remembers Nahida. However, he doesn't refer to Nahida by either of the names we've referred to her as up to this point. Instead, he calls her Boor, and right away, we get our first tangent. So for those unaware, every Archon has a name that is derived from the names of various demons in demonology. More specifically, every Archon shares a name with one demon listed in the Ars Goetia, a list of 72 demons that rule over hell. Venti's demon name is Barbados, sharing a name with Duke Barbados. Zhongli's Morax, sharing a name with Count or President Morax. A's demon name is Baal, which is probably derived from King Baal. And Nahida is named Boor, who is a president / count, the same as Morax. What's interesting about Boor is that the demon with the name was first mentioned in the predecessor to the Ars Goetia, the Pseudomonarchia Daemonum? The Pseudomonarchia Daemonum. Who taught us philosophy, logic, and herbology of all things. This, surprisingly enough, fits Nahida really well. Crazy. He's also known to bestow familiars, which is something that Nahida does right before this fight, giving us this cool little familiar guy for the fight, who is adorable. I have a bit more to say regarding demon names at the end of this when we get to that talking point about the Hydra Archon, so just stay tuned for that. It gets kind of interesting. So Skara does his funny monologue thing because he's big bad evil, and says that he feels like he has transcended into a god. Note here that Nahida does call Skara a god, but she says it in quotations in the subtitles. I think that what this implies is that a god is not some hard and fast defined thing. Skara here is what most humans would consider a god, even though he didn't obtain that title in the most orthodox of ways. I think Nahida is just going to show how woogity the term god is in Teyvat. It barely means anything, and I think even to her, Skara isn't really a god, he's just a really powerful being. What Skara has to say about it is also rather interesting, because he says his spirit ascended to divinity, and that doing so has made him feel like he has existed for, quote, the same number of epochs as heaven and earth. I find epoch a weird term to use here because it refers to a period of time that is marked by a major event. Think of an epoch as just a different term for an era. As an example, the Elder Scrolls timeline is split into many different eras, each marked by a major event. The era we are currently in the Elder Scrolls timeline, the 4th era, was marked by the death of Uriel Septim at the beginning of Oblivion. The death of Uriel marked the end of the 3rd era and started the 4th, and you can refer to these eras as epochs as well. They're the same thing, really. So what Skara is saying here is that it feels like his soul has existed for the same number of eras as the heaven and earth itself has existed, which does a few things. One, it confirms that there is a heaven, and that has existed for presumably as long as the earth. And two, it implies the fact that ascension to godhood changes your existence almost, unless Skara is completely exaggerating and just being kind of poetic for the sake of it. Something seemingly fundamental about your soul changes and becomes eternal almost when you become a god. I feel like this fundamental something is something along the lines of becoming more closely tied to Irminsul. If Irminsul is as fundamental to Teyvat as it's implied to be, then there is a good chance that the creation of Irminsul was the creation of Teyvat, and that being closer to Irminsul or being tied to Irminsul more directly would make your soul feel as if you have lived for as long as Irminsul has. This also kind of implies that Skara might have a soul, which is kind of neat. I don't know. The next line I want to talk about is one that I completely glossed over while playing, actually, but looking back is kind of huge and foreshadows the revelations that happen at the end of the quest. When Skara closes his fancy helmet and becomes the Everlasting Lord of Arcane Wisdom, which is a dope-ass title, he says that strife is imprinted on every god and every gnosis brought forth into this world. Brought forth, huh? Interesting choice of words. Brought forth almost implies that gods and gnosis are brought from somewhere else and planted onto Teyvat. It implies that gods and gnosis are foreign. They weren't made in Teyvat, but they were brought here by something else with strife carved into their very soul. I also feel like this line is so out of place in the context of the exchange that's happening between the Traveler and Nahida and Skara. He just kind of says it without being prompted and then moves on. It's really weird. Nahida backpedals into the line, though, acknowledging the fact that Skara mentioned strife engraved on gnosises. She says that the strife was a result of the Archon War. She says that the peace that Teyvat currently resides in was not easily won, implying that peace has been spread across Teyvat since the end of the war, which is very much not true, but we'll move on. And that the Archon War was a frivolous war. She says that it was driven by the demand of the quote-unquote laws. Okay. Ever since the release of this game, there has been this really strange loading screen tooltip that says that Teyvat has its own laws, with laws in quotation marks. People have always found this weird and interesting and have always tried to frantically theorize about what these laws could be. But I was always of the opinion that, while strange, it was probably just referring to Teyvat having its own laws of physics or whatever. People always assume that it was laws as in like laws enforced by some higher power, but I always read it as like natural laws, more like just how the world functions. This and a few other lines later completely disproves me in that regard. These laws are 100% laws enforced by some higher power, like societal laws. So we fight Skara, beat his ass, and then we move on. When Skara plummets to the ground, Nahida goes and retrieves the Electro-Gnosis, allowing us to get our very first good look at the Electro-Gnosis, and it is not a knight. Yeah, this tossed up chess theory is something fierce. For those that are unaware, chess theory is a study of how chess and its associated symbolism applies to Genshin's story. Chess is this huge motif in the story, so an entire school of study has sprouted from it, and people have taken it upon themselves to analyze the importance of chess in the game. And it's something that I intend on making a video about because it's way too long and complicated of a subject to cover entirely here. However, the core of chess theory is the fact that every Archon's Gnosis is in the shape of a certain chess piece. Up until this cutscene, we figured that Venti's Gnosis was the queen and Zhongli's is obviously a rook, and we have theorized through a plethora of evidence that A's was a knight. But now that we actually get to see it, it really is not a knight. So right away, I want to acknowledge the argument that, oh, it's a samurai helmet, so it's still a knight. Samurais are just the Japanese equivalent of knights. Yeah, this seems like a reasonable argument at first. It's definitely a way to keep the previous theory that A was the knight going strong in our interpretation of the chessboard of Winter Nights that's so consistent. But here's the thing, it's a samurai helmet isn't enough to just say it's a knight and move on. It's very much trying to be another chess piece, and I have the receipts, don't worry. First of all, chessboards are designed in a way that makes every piece distinct from each other. A player needs to know exactly which piece is which without a moment of second guessing. That's why the standard board design you see in every single chess set is the way it is. Every piece is distinct and recognizable at a glance. That's why the knight is a horse. It's easy to see the horse's shape and say, yeah, that's a knight, and then you can immediately start analyzing where it can go and the plays you can make with it. If A's Gnosis was supposed to be a knight, it looks remarkably like a multitude of other pieces, and while the practicality of playing with this piece probably isn't on Hoyoverse's mind, being able to tell what it is at a glance with smart design most definitely is. The second argument is the fact that samurai were analogous to knights in Japan. This is true. This is entirely true. And this point sounds pretty good until you realize that 90% of the reason samurai were as successful as they were is because they had horses. Japan is not far from China in the Mongolian steppe, where horses were first tamed. They were probably brought over really early in Japan's history. They quickly made their way down to Japan, and because of that, horses were a staple in Japanese combat for as long as swords and bows and arrows were the main weaponry found on the island. So if Hoyoverse wanted to make A's Gnosis a knight, they still would have used a horse. So this fact kind of threw chess theory for a loop, because now we don't know who the knight is, and we aren't entirely sure where A's Gnosis fits in. Right now, we have two possibilities at this point. It could either be a queen, or it could be a bishop. Oh, but well, Venti's Gnosis is the queen, right? Oh, well, look at that. His Gnosis is in the same spot as Deep Blue's king. That's a neat coincidence that literally every single piece is in the correct spot except for Venti's queen piece. Why could that be? Anyways, let's keep moving. That's not a topic for this video. We move on to the scene where we jump into the final memory of Greater Lord Rukkhadevata, and I'm going to skip through most of this stuff as it's really not important until we get to Irminsul itself. Really, the only thing of note is the fact that Nahida confirmed that King Deshret and Rukkhadevata's sacrifice was to control a forbidden knowledge outbreak that happened before Khaenri'ah got a hold of their forbidden knowledge, which also confirmed that Khaenri'ah was destroyed due to forbidden knowledge and not like anything else. So we meet Rukkhadevata, who has taken the form of Nahida because she just felt funny or something, I don't know. She says some introductory things and then drops the big ol' line,
"Because you are me, and I am you. You are me in the new samsara."
Oh, no fucking way did you just did that. No. So this is big because this implies that everything is in a larger samsara. For those that didn't pay attention during the beginning of the quest, or have just forgotten, a samsara in both Genshin and in Buddhism refers to the time that is cyclical in nature. In Buddhism, samsara refers to the idea that all human life is cyclical, where we are born, die, and then are reborn in a circular fashion. In Genshin, the idea of a samsara is applied to the world as a whole instead of the people of the world specifically. And this line implies the fact that Teyvat as an entirety is in a samsara, that history is a cycle, and that the world repeats itself with slight changes every time. This has been theorized many times before to the dismay of the people theorizing it, but this really confirms it. And that's something that this quest does quite a lot, actually. It just confirms instead of introducing new ideas, which I think is really neat, or at least it has been confirming ideas. As we move on from here, new ideas in words are thrown at us at quite a regular frequency, so the theorizing is going to get way more speculative. So pretty much, Rukkhadevata explains that when she died, she snapped off the purest branch of Irminsul and allowed that to form into Nahida. She did this while the rest of the seven were in Khaenri'ah, dealing with them and their blasphemy and forbidden knowledge stuff. After isolating the purest part of Irminsul, Rukkhadevata sacrificed herself in order to cleanse the world from the forbidden knowledge, which helped cleanse Irminsul. However, the people of Sumeru and Teyvat still remembered Rukkhadevata, meaning that her consciousness, which contained that forbidden knowledge, or at least the knowledge of the forbidden knowledge, still existed, meaning that the world has not entirely gotten rid of the knowledge, so Irminsul remained sick. Rukkhadevata tries her best to explain what this forbidden knowledge exactly is, or at least her best understanding of it, and pretty much she says it's kind of a truth that can't be understood that comes from the depths of the abyss. Straight away, you will notice that she says it is a truth. So whatever the abyss is doing, it has to do with an absolute truth about this world. Not a deception, not a lie, a truth. What's even stranger is that this truth is something that Rukkhadevata herself admits to not being able to comprehend. This relates back to that really odd line that Dottore speaks during Winter's Night's Lazzo, where he says that conventional wisdom holds that divine knowledge cannot be rationally comprehended. So for humans, there is divine knowledge that we can't comprehend, and for the divine, there is knowledge even above that they can't understand. But apparently, and this is just me theorizing, the relation isn't transitive, because humans, once they find the knowledge, can comprehend it fine. Yeah, so pretty much Rukkhadevata says that her existence is a source of pollution, as she was aware of the knowledge. And in Teyvat, as we know, the consciousness of gods doesn't immediately go away when they die. So Rukkhadevata pretty much tells Nahida to pull in Elizabeth at the end of Bioshock Infinite and remove her from the memory of everybody so she, in practicality, never existed. Okay, sidebar, but I do want to point out the similarities between this and the end of Bioshock Infinite. So for those that don't know, in the end of that game, spoilers, it's revealed that the person that you play as, Booker DeWitt, is the same as the main antagonist, Joseph Comstock, and that the difference is that in the timelines in which Comstock exists are the timelines where Booker got baptized in a river after he came home from fighting in the Vietnam War, I think, and changed his name to Joseph Comstock. So at the end of the game, your time-traveling, timeline-hopping companion and daughter, it's complicated Elizabeth, kills Booker right before his baptism, which creates a paradox, which, in order for things to be consistent, forces the universe to just default to never having a timeline where Comstock exists. So Elizabeth goes back and forces the universe to forget the concept of Comstock to avoid a paradox, which also prevents the events of the game happening. And here Nahida is forcing the world to forget Rukkhadevata to force the world to go back to normal and forget forbidden knowledge. Now, granted, the details are a bit different, and we're not dealing paradoxes, instead we're just dealing with curing a tree. And pretty much the entire purpose of this paragraph is to rant about how genius the end of Bioshock Infinite is, but it's still kind of neat. Okay, back to it. I swear, fast talking mode is off. So Nahida does that, we have a cutscene where we cry a bit, and then we're back in the Sanctuary of Saristana, where Nahida says she's confused because what she did worked. She doesn't remember Rukkhadevata. Nobody else remembers her, except us. We do. And that's the real contention here. We remember her, and chances are we are the only ones that remember. This is something that's talked about in the rest of the quest, but the implications of it aren't until the very end. He's not forgetting her. No! So here's the real meat of this quest, and here's the part that I really want to focus on because almost all of the revelations come from this scene specifically. Traveler falls down and falls asleep after a strange noise comes from somewhere, and Nahida watches as Dottore walks into view. So the conversation between Dottore and Nahida has a lot of formalities and small talk and bluffs and whatever. So let's just run down the list of really interesting things that are said in this exchange. First, Dottore, when talking about his aspects, mentions that he created them because the world lacks dimension, particularly that of time. The world lacks the dimension of time. This to me is very much trying to, as subtly as possible, imply Istaroth. How Dottore says this line comes off as none the wiser that something like Istaroth ever existed, but because Dottore has his aspects, he can see something about the world that not very many others have seen or noticed. That time is fucking weird in Teyvat, and that's possibly because Istaroth is also very, very strange in her nature. I do not think that Dottore knows of Istaroth. I still think that we are the only ones that know who she is. What I do think is that Dottore has enough knowledge and perspective to eventually hypothesize about the existence of Istaroth. He understands better than anybody that time in Teyvat is completely meaningless. And so he is just one why away from starting down that rabbit hole. But that's all I have to say on that one. I think it's just a little nod from the writers to those that actually read before Sun and Moon. Next, the big boy, Nahida's bluff, where she threatens to destroy the Electro-Gnosis and awaken the heavenly principles. I'm just going to play the clip from the stream VOD and then we'll talk about it.
After all, I'm also a scholar. Naturally, I hope to show proper respect and dignity to the god of wisdom.
Then fucking
your
talk to her.
Is built on absolute confidence.
Yep.
I understand your scheme, but what if I were to destroy the Gnosis now and awaken the heavenly principles?
No. What the fuck? What the fuck? Oh, we're getting into serious shit. Okay, so I've gotten plenty of time to think this one through, and I think I have a pretty solid interpretation of this line and this idea. Something I need to make clear, first and foremost, is the distinction between heavenly principles and the sustainer of heavenly principles, who Ashikai calls Susti, and I'm going to steal that. They are not the same thing. Heavenly principles is not short for the sustainer of heavenly principles. I want to nail this point into y'all's head because this is extremely important for you to understand. The term heavenly principles is in Chinese Tianli, and Susti's full title is Tianli de Wei Xi Zhe, which translates directly to the heavenly laws maintainer. Something else I need to also point out is the fact that the term heavenly principles and the term Celestia are also used synonymously throughout the game's texts. Okay, we got that? Good. Okay, so we know that Teyvat has laws that are inherent to its functioning. These laws are put into place by the heavenly principles, aka Celestia, and if these laws are broken, then the heavenly principles awake, where they proceed to punish those that have done wrong and fix the mess that they've made. So when humanity is being all good and nice, Celestia is asleep, and when they're bad, Celestia awakens and descends upon Earth. My theory is that Celestia is a force that has many avatars that manifest that act on behalf of these heavenly principles. And one of these avatars, these manifestations of the heavenly principles, is Susti. It is very possible that Susti is one of the stronger manifestations, but she is a manifestation or an extension of the heavenly principles nonetheless. Something else to take away from this is that the Gnosises are required to exist in Teyvat by law. It's almost like the US Postal Service or the military. Those two organizations are written in law. They cannot not exist. If Nahida really were to be able to destroy the Gnosis, then that would throw the entirety of Teyvat into whack. Doing this would then awaken Celestia, who is now implied to be asleep. They're dormant, which kind of devalues my triangle video, but it does make the fact that the Fatui are doing what they're doing still make sense. They are dormant, and humanity hasn't really broken any laws yet. They've just acted in very bad faith, so they haven't had an explicit reason to wake up. The only question that this theory leaves us with is, who the fuck gives out visions then? In the Inazuma Archon quest, we learned that the Archons don't give out visions, so we immediately assumed that Celestia did. But now that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It's something that we'll have to figure out because visions are still super vague in their functionality. The next line that Nahida speaks is really cool because it does confirm that Celestia is a they, multiple people or beings or whatever that control Teyvat. Or at least I think so. So the Chinese line doesn't actually use pronouns when referring to the heavenly principles. They always say Tianli. She gladly refers to gnosis as ta, the Chinese third-person pronoun, but never with heavenly principles. Moving on, a quick one to mention is that Nahida says that the foreign gnosis will cause disaster in Sumeru, which, I don't know, I find it a little bit odd that that line points out the fact that a foreign gnosis will cause disaster. Foreign specifically. Maybe as a part of the definition of the gnosises, they have to stay in their respective nation or stuff will start to go haywire. It's weirdly worded and it's very vague, so I don't know. Okay, so Nahida gives away the electrognosis, and then Dottore asks about the dendrognosis, and she says no, and then Dottore says this.
Besides, isn't it the Archon's duty to deliver what's desired of the Seeker?
Hey, Mahoyo. What the fuck? Okay, so before this quest was released fully, Nahida got her collected miscellany, and at the very end of the trailer, Dane said that gods are not the ones in charge in the world, but instead they just kind of exist. They're just beings that exist, but they're just are more powerful than humans. That prompted me to make this tweet that blew up, where a lot of people responded by saying that we kind of knew that. So let me take this chance to explain myself here. So yes, we have known for quite a while that gods aren't really the rulers of Teyvat. It's something that you can kind of infer based on how various gods act in the histories and the fact that Celestia exists, which, as we have discussed up to this point, the real top dogs here, enforcing the laws and whatever. And while Dane does say God in that line, I think he really implies Archon because the trailer shows only Archons. So with the combination of the visuals in the line, you could translate it into Archons are not the rulers of Teyvat, which is also something that you could kind of infer, but then that naturally leads into the line of questioning of what are they? Why do they exist? What is the point of an Archon if not to rule? This question drove me insane because at the core of it, there's another more specific question. What was the point of the Archon War then? What promise came with the 7 seats that entitled every single god to fight to the death? So to answer this, we need to start with actual Gnosticism. So in Gnosticism, an Archon is a being that controls one of the 7 planets and is tasked with preventing souls from leaving each planet. What's interesting is that Archon in Greek literally translates into ruler. So it almost seems that the term Archon is a misnomer, which might seem like a big deal until you realize that Archon is just the English translation thing and that Archons are referred to as demon gods in Chinese, but also very rarely. The only time the term demon god is used in the Chinese version is in the title Archon Quest. They're usually referred to as the 7 or Qi, I think, or one of the 7 gods, which makes things a little less weird, but I digress. So in Gnosticism, each of the Archons are tasked with preventing souls from leaving the planets they reside on, which sounds remarkably familiar to Genshin, right? Allegenes is a fancy word for people that have a vision and describe their ability to become a god or an Archon. So it almost feels like the job of the Archons is to keep the Allegenes from ascending, which does make sense. And that's cool. That's a theory that has existed out and about for a very long time, but that still doesn't answer the core, deeper question. Why the Archon War? I don't think hundreds of gods would fight to the death for the chance to control humanity in the most pedantic way possible. And here is where what Dottore said comes into play. He says that it is the Archon's duty to deliver what is desired of the Seeker. What this means specifically is something I don't think we will be able to know for quite a while, but I do think I know what this implies. All the way back when we were facing off with Scaramouche, Nahida mentioned that the Archon War was fought because of the laws, that the laws required the fighting to happen in the first place. This, combined with the fact that the Seeker, which isn't capitalized in English, oddly enough, sounds really ominous and powerful, makes me believe that the Archons were cornered into fighting each other in order to keep Teyvat going. I feel like whatever the Seeker is, desires something, and if that thing isn't delivered, that's it. That's the end of Teyvat. The Archons are there to make sure that this doesn't happen. I think Celestia knew that this task would be extremely difficult and that they could only have the best and strongest of the gods to perform this task, and so required the gods to fight it out. I think this also explains Havria. She was killed by Morax possibly because she was seen as a traitor. She didn't want to partake in the war, meaning that she didn't want to serve Celestia and do what was best for Teyvat, which was, keeping it alive. So she was killed for her treachery. Either way, I think figuring out what this seeker thing is from now on probably going to be the holy grail of lore. Once we understand what the seeker is, not capitalized, which still drives me bonkers, what it wants and why it wants it, then so many questions about how the gods and Celestia function will just fall into place, I feel like. But right now, it's only breadcrumbs that we're following, so I'm going to move on. So Dottore says that, and then says he wants to trade knowledge for the Dendrognosis. Then he says the line with a term that we have not heard spoken for nearly 2 years.
Let me ask you, have you in all your mighty knowledge ever heard the rumor that the skies of Teyvat are fake?
No fucking way, 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 no fucking way.
That's the secret hidden by Ermin's soul concerning the truth of this world.
So here's what's so fascinating about this. This truth that Dottore is talking about here might be the forbidden knowledge, which in theory should have been completely removed from this world with the erasure of Rukkhadevata. As a result, if the truth that Dottore speaks of here really is the forbidden knowledge, then that leaves literally one possibility. Dottore is not from this world. Think about it. We, the traveler, still remember Rukkhadevata and know that there is a forbidden knowledge. But as we learn at the end of the quest, we are not tied to Ermin's soul, so that's why we can remember everything still. So if what Dottore is talking about here is forbidden knowledge, then there is literally no conceivable way that his knowing of the forbidden knowledge could have survived Rukkhadevata's removal from the world. So we have two options now. Either Dottore is from this world, and the truth he speaks of is completely separate and different from the abyssal truth that has been deemed forbidden by fuck knows what, or that Dottore isn't from this world, and the truth of which he speaks is that forbidden knowledge and is corrupting Ermin's soul once again. Just throwing that out there. So he says that he will tell Nahida this and then leave, and she agrees. And the splash text we get following says that secrets and dark truths flow to the mind of the wise. Dark truths is an interesting way of saying that, considering the abyss is rather dark. That's just me stretching it, though. Okay, let's skip over the fun dinner scene, even though it's cute as hell, to our sit-down chat with Nahida. Really, the only thing that Nahida says that is of interest to us, that isn't the last thing, which we'll get to, is the fact that the Hydro Archon's name is Focalor. This is interesting, I think, because it is rather uncommon for us to have an Archon refer us to another Archon by their demon name. Okay, so Genshin really likes the rule of 3, and one thing that follows this pattern are names. Most Archons have 3 names that more or less fall into 3 categories. Their alias, what I like to call their ceremonial name, and their demon name. Alias is what they just go by in day-to-day life. So Zhongli, Venti, A, Nahida, whatever. Ceremonial names, as I like to call them, is what Archons are usually referred to as in religious contexts, i.e. Rex Lapis, Raiden Shogun, and Lesser Lord Kusanali. And the demon names are just their demon names. In the past, the only time an Archon sit-down chat has given us the demon name of the next Archon is in Zhongli's sit-down chat, which refers to Makoto's demon name, Baal, and not A's name, Beelzebul. Which is interesting alone, but, it's whatever. So Focalor in demonology is the Duke of Hell that shares actually rather few similarities with the little we know about the Hydro Archon. The only interesting thing that I found is that in demonology, like the actual demon Focalor has a second name, Lucifuge Rufosale, the last name of which is an anagram for Focalor. Okay, then we try to disengage from the conversation. Nahida asks if there is something else we haven't asked about yet, which, yes, is our sister. I think Aether didn't intend on asking about Lumine because so far it's been dead end after dead end, and I don't think he expected Nahida to actually have any information, but, here we go. Okay, so I'm saving the best talking point for last because this has a lot of meat on its bones. There are actually 3 major points of discussion here. 1, Lumine existing in Ermin's soul, while we do not. 2, Lumine data getting fuzzy towards the end of her journey, and 3, the whole Descender discussion. I'm going to start with the second point because those other guys are fucking huge. So the only theory that I could come up with as to why Lumine's data gets really fuzzy at the end of her journey is because that is when she started associating herself with the Abyss. The problem with that is that the forbidden knowledge originates from the Abyss, and by definition, the forbidden knowledge can't exist in Irminsul, or else just Teyvat stops working or something, I don't know. So what if, as Lumine started associating herself with the Abyss, she started getting closer and closer to that forbidden knowledge, and or directly related to it, and to combat that, Irminsul just automatically made her data unclear. That's literally the only thing I can think of, except for what comes up in the second talking point, which is the fact that Lumine, for some reason, according to Irminsul, belongs to Teyvat. This, obviously, results in a not unsubstantial amount of logical contradictions to arise, some of which are helpfully pointed out by both Aether and Paimon. So we're left to try and figure out how this could make sense, and I think I have a theory to make this work. I think the one thing that's going to help this make sense is to think about Irminsul not as a big old tree that somehow has magical information and memories in it, but instead to think of it as a computer in a database. It's just one big database about everything in Teyvat, which, yes, I'm aware this analogy could actually be a genuine interpretation of what Irminsul is and might back up the idea that Teyvat is a simulation, but that's not for this video. Irminsul has a record of every person that belongs to Teyvat, which is to say that people like Aether, which Nahida tells us are called the Descenders by the Fatui, do not exist in this database. Irminsul can't collect data on you if you don't exist in its eyes. But here's the thing. If Irminsul can't collect data on a data point that doesn't exist, what's stopping somebody from somehow creating a data point in the database through some sort of like funky backdoor or something and to add their name manually? Well, I think this is what Lumine did. I think that she somehow figured out a way to get access to Irminsul's database, which allows her to add herself to the database to avoid suspicion of whatever she's doing or whatever, and to change, modify, and obfuscate data about herself as she pleases. I think this was all done as a result of the Loom of Fate operation. We were told that the point of the Loom of Fate is to reweave the threads of fate. I think there is no other way of doing this than literally rewriting history, and in order to do this, Lumine had to tie herself to Teyvat. Now that she actually has a tangible existence here, she can start doing all the funny things with fate. This is a very rough theory, and I think there's a little bit more building that I need to do in my head, a little bit more thinking, but it's the only one that makes sense to me. Somehow, Lumine has a backdoor into Irminsul and has changed the data on her within it to benefit herself. And finally, the Descenders. This talking point is actually one of the loosest ones, and one I'm not going to spend very much time on because, you know, it's the very end of the video. Because we can argue all day about who is what Descender, but at the end of the day, we only know the identity of one Descender for sure, and that's Aether. Nahida says that she hypothesized that Heavenly Principles is the first, but that's purely a hypothesis. It's not even a theory, it's just an educated guess. Knowing Nahida, it's probably a very educated guess, but it's a guess nonetheless. And we don't know who 2 and 3 could be. We don't even know if there are more than 4 Descenders. There probably are, just by the fact that we can count 5 mentions of people coming from the world that aren't from here. The wielder of Snowtomb Starsilver, who is strictly stated to be an Outlander, Fanes, the second who came, if you count them as 2 different things, Aloy, if you consider her to be canonical, and probably Alice. But like, 2 of them are still unclear, and notice that I used weasel words in listing goddamn every person in that list. But all that aside, it's nice to know, though, that Teyvat differentiates people that are foreign to this world. Teyvat reacts differently to Outlanders, so much so that the Fatui track them for some reason, which is extremely, extremely interesting and gives us some insights into both how Teyvat works and what the Fatui are trying to do. And that was the Sumeru Archon quest, or at least the last, 3 scenes of it. There are still a few bits and pieces I want to discuss, such as the tree and Odin, and there's a few discussions that I didn't have time for. This script is already long enough. So there are probably major talking points that you're screaming at me to discuss, but don't worry, I'm aware of them. I just chose not to talk about them because, God, this video is so long. I'm excited with where the story of this game is going, and I'm so glad that this game did actually take a darker turn. Now that, you know, Rukkhadevata is gone, we are starting to make substantial changes to the world. Literally nobody remembers who Rukkhadevata is. That's cool. There are substantial changes going on in the world, and we're making real impact on everything. And I'm so looking forward to the next time we meet Dane and possibly our sister, and even beyond that in 4.0 when we eventually get to meet Focalor. But that's all I have, so I will see y'all in the next video. Bye-bye.